Hi, folks. Also looks like my slides will have very small text. Apologies for that. First, I want to take a second to thank Nick for answering my multiple extension requests and the other OFA organizers, FGV for hosting us, and for all you lovely people for sharing your ideas. I've really enjoyed our conversations. And yeah, I'm looking forward to what OFA has next year. And it's also an honor to be on the panel with everybody else talking about security and sustainability in open source. So looking forward to that discussion too. My work is sort of piggybacking off of Jonathan's work in terms of maintainership concerns, and also Ijoma's work on communities and newcomers in open source. So this is about my ongoing dissertation work, which is on the experiences of early career and potential open source newcomers. Yes. So I don't need to tell everybody here, open source is very important. It's important to our global digital infrastructure. And we have focused on the government, industry, and academic connections. What I'd like to talk a little bit more about are the developers themselves and the communities that make open source the phenomenon that it is today. So open source projects are virtual communities of practice where individual developers come together for these sites of peer production and superposition to develop these large code bases that they wouldn't be able to do on their own. And so they build these advanced software artifacts that we are all dependent on. Because open source is so dependent on the people behind it, it's very important to study the social phenomenon within it, such that the dynamics of and the health of open source communities have a direct impact on open source software production, quality, and sustainability. Looking forward, ongoing social phenomena bring cause for concern for the future of open source. What I mean by that is, so this is showed up in Jonathan's talk as well. So there's an ongoing problem with maintainership. There's copious amounts of software that someone needs to maintain, manage all of these dependencies, and as a result, we have this emergence of an archetype of a lone maintainer who is thanklessly managing immense amounts of code, often with no financial compensation. And so overwhelmed with project responsibilities, about 60% of maintainers have reported quitting or considered quitting their projects in a survey done last year, raising concerns about the sustainability of open source going forward. Additionally, we've also talked about cybersecurity concerns, such as the potential SSH backdoor of the XE package last year, and how maintainers are increasingly becoming the targets of cybersecurity attacks. More recently, we're finding that the open source maintainer community is getting older. So a 2020 survey of open source maintainers found that the percentage of maintainers under the age of 25 has dropped from 25% in 2021 to just 10% in 2024. And we can see that the distribution is about the same, but it's just shifting, which means that maintainers are sticking around, they're continuing to develop, maintain these projects, but younger contributors are not stepping up and inheriting these maintainership roles, and that's a cause for concern in the long term. This is a more recent issue, but I also want to talk about an ongoing issue, which has been the ongoing open source diversity crisis. So a lot of research has been poured into this area. So in 2021, the Octoverse survey found that just about 90% of contributors in their survey identified as male. We also find that this hasn't really improved. I mean, it's improved somewhat over the past couple of years. It's been bumped up to 5 to 10%. How that number is defined depends on the ecosystem that they're working in. Python and Rust, for example, have a much higher proportion of women contributors due to a couple of reasons, but one being their association with scientific software, whereas other languages, other ecosystems have less women represented. I do want to note that a lot of this research does focus on influential projects, ecosystems, and is very US-centric. There's not so much data on the representation of Black, Hispanic contributors in open source, especially in the US. There's emerging data coming out for how open source is being affected by growth globally. But at the moment, a lot of this work on diversity has been focused on the US and women. And yeah, we see that this is in comparison to women making up 27% of developers at the US industry level. And so I've given you the rundown on what the current state of open source software is, including emerging maintainership concerns, as well as the ongoing lack of diversity. And this brings cause for concern for its future. So in the future, we want to ensure healthy and diverse open source communities, such that the software we develop reflects its user base, such that we are taking in diverse perspectives, such that we are able to sustainably inherit and maintain these immense code bases. And so we also need a better understanding of open source participation and what that can look like for different groups. And so my dissertation seeks to attain a better understanding of the future of open source by studying early contributors as well as potential contributors now. And so to do that, I have this overarching question where how can we enhance open source software communities to encourage and sustain future diverse participation? One thing I like to note is that I am putting emphasis on what the communities can do. A lot of the work has focused on individual contributors leaving the open source pipeline. The pipeline metaphor itself is problematic, and I don't want to place any blame for diverse contributors who don't advance to maintainership roles. The focus here is on what open source communities can do. And diverse means not just in terms of gender representation, but also in terms of racial, ethnic participation, and participation from those coming from different socioeconomic backgrounds. Sorry, my slide was off. Right, to do this, I'm doing 2 studies for my dissertation. I'm just gonna talk about one today, partially because the first one hasn't been done yet. But the first one is seeking to, I'm distributing a survey among introductory programming students to see what they know about open source, if anything at all. What do they think about it? What are their perceptions? What do they perceive to be the risks of contributing to open source? What are the benefits? And if from these survey results, are there differences in how people think about open source depending on their social identity? And so that's happening soon, but I'm talking about something a little bit later in the pipeline, which is interviews with open source educators. So I decided to talk to educators to get their understanding of, one, how they introduce open source to students, also in what ways do they prepare students for open source participation? Do they mandate that students need to make a contribution to a project? Why or why not? Additionally, what do they perceive to be the barriers for open source participation? Do these barriers change, or are there any unique challenges for students who are coming from underrepresented backgrounds? And so, yeah, that motivated my educator study. And so to do this, I talked to educators at different universities across the US. I apologize for keeping the scope limited to the US, but I do want to graduate eventually in the short term. But future work could expand beyond the US. And so I focused on courses that teach Git control. There were some courses where the emphasis wasn't really on open source itself, but open source as a medium for other types of technological development. I also leveraged the Curios network, which we've heard about a couple of times today, so the university open source program office networks, a couple of boot camps and hackathons, which weren't super responsive. They kept referring me to their PR departments, which was dumb, but, and also some snowballing. So I talked to these educators. This, an example of like a couple of the sites. So CMU, Carnegie Mellon, has a really good course on foundations of software engineering, where they encourage students to find different open source projects and eventually contribute to these projects. Different courses, institutions had different setups, but the majority of courses did expect students to eventually make some sort of code contribution to an open source project. This was some examples of the boot camps. I talked to an educator from Coursera who was really interesting to talk to. And yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the results. So I collected the course materials. So this was the syllabi of all these courses, as well as any other relevant materials. So yeah, mostly the syllabi. And so I ended up doing semi-structured interviews with 23 educators. I asked them about their teaching background, their open source background, how they got into this, if these were courses that they had inherited or developed themselves, how they introduced open source to their students. Did they expect their students to make an eventual contribution? What is their definition of a contribution? And yeah, what they saw as barriers to student learning. What did they see that students were, why were students taking these classes? Why were they motivated to take these classes? And besides challenges, what were also the sources of joy or inspiration for students? Why did they enjoy this and keep coming back? And I ended up doing follow-ups with 6 alumni as well, which were really interesting. I will say, and I'll talk about this a little bit more, pretty much all of the educators were much older, cis white men, but all of the alumni I spoke to were non-white and half were women, so it was good to get a lot of different perspectives there. So I'm not going to spend too much time on methodology, but I can talk more about it if someone has questions, but grounded theory was my analytical method. So to talk about what the educators found, so first off, they had to teach students about what is open source, and for the most part, most students didn't really know what it was. In some cases, it was a requirement or just the next step. And there were plenty of cases where students even had misconceived notions of what open source was. This was partially due to open washing, which we've heard about several times. So one educator said students would say, oh yeah, I use open source, I use ChatGPT, and the educators would have to explain, that's not open source. And the students are like, oh, well, it's open AI, so open's in the name. And so this educator in particular said, so open washing is a real thing, and we have an uphill battle as open source educators to overcome that. So not only teaching students about open source, but also undoing some of the harmful performative marketing done by some of these companies. Additionally, the educators took different approaches to introducing open source. I would say the majority did ground their courses in some sort of discussion of the free software movement and the origins of the ethos of open source. Yeah, they would talk, peer production, whereas there were a couple who instead didn't really engage in the ethos of open source and were instead focused on open source's contemporary role in digital supply chains. So most educators believe that if students had some intrinsic connection or motivation in an open source project, they would be more successful. There was some prior research finding that humanitarian open source projects are really good at keeping students motivated, especially underrepresented students. And so this was the example for one of my educators who discussed how some of their students were on food stamps or had benefited from government programs and were really excited to give back to those programs and the open source projects associated with them. So in this case, the students were actively updating the website for these foods, for the food bank that they themselves had gotten food from before. So that was really cool to see. Additionally, as I mentioned, a lot of educators knew that students, their ultimate goal is to find a job and to find a job as a software engineer. So open source, these courses were great because it went beyond the more theoretical coursework that students were experiencing, and it was much more applied, and students felt like they were getting a sense of what the day-to-day life is as a software engineer working in industry. So this includes Git control, continuous integration, actually multiple software developers working on one project at the same time. Also grappling with immense code bases. So also going upstream, downstream, figuring out what the dependencies were. So oftentimes this was students' first foray into real life software engineering. Another thing was that educators really highlighted how important it was for students to become integrated with the communities. There were some educators who talked about when they first did these courses, students would just sort of all submit these PRs at the end of the course, and there would just be like a flurry that would overwhelm maintainers. Most students wouldn't get a response. They didn't really know how to grade students in that case. And so what some educators ended up doing was insisting that students make contact with the projects early on in the semester, start coordinating with a maintainer or a mentor, try to figure out where they can make a contribution, where they can be most helpful, and they really encourage long-term relationships and building up an online reputation with these projects, which was really cool to see. And additionally, they talked about how this is a chance for students to work in public and build up their digital resumes. So a lot of the students that I talked to spoke, and I'll talk more about this, but this was essentially a chance for them to develop their profiles as emerging technologists. And so once they're on the job market, they had experience, that experience was verified if their PRs had been merged, and so it was a way to streamline through the hiring process. One participant talked about how at their university in particular, it was a very expensive university, and they said that it really only makes sense if you're going to get a high-paying job when you graduate. I think a lot of students feel that tension. I'm not trying to sell the vision of like open source is about teaching the world to sing in harmony, right? The vast majority of students will work at companies that support open source projects. So this educator in particular explicitly said, I don't think it's more noble to contribute to open source as opposed to closed source. It's what people will end up doing anyway, and he didn't really have a strong stance on it. So yeah, that was just interesting to see that in this educator's case, the bottom line is making sure students have a job and a high-paying job afterwards. So as I mentioned, most of the educators I talked to who are authority figures in the classroom were older cis white men, but they were very intentional and thoughtful about how they could connect with their increasingly diverse student populations. And so one way that a lot of educators did this was by having diverse guest lecturers. So in one example, a educator first brought in a white male venture capitalist who had a real tech bro vibe, and students came up to the educator and pointed out that he reinforced this stereotype of white male software engineers, capitalism, working 7 days a week, grinding it out, yada yada. But then later, they pushed back on the educator's choice in guest lecture, which the educator was actually really pleased about. And then later on, they had a woman tech executive, and they invited her over for dinner. And a lot of students came, a lot of students engaged with her, and it ended up being a really thoughtful discussion about gender issues in the tech industry. And this was really inspiring for a lot of students. And now to talk a little bit about what the alumni said. So there was this idea of most students seeing open source as a short-term investment. Ultimately, it's a means to an end, with the end being finding a high-paying job as a software engineer. And they loved that they could have an applied experience by taking this course. They get course credit, they get real-life experience. What's not to love? But on the other hand, a lot of them didn't continue to contribute after they got the job. There was one student I talked to in particular who had who didn't exactly do that. He had a very interesting perspective. First off, he cited his identity as a Chinese American student, and he talked about how his culture promotes being studious and how that related to his perception of open source. So he says his opinion is very different among younger generations of millennials, Gen Z, where there's a little bit of a culture of you should not do work for free, which is valid. But he sort of likened open source to social security, where you gotta put in time, you gotta put in effort before you will get anything out of it. So this person was still contributing to open source, but most of the alumni I spoke to, they would like to. It really ended up being them saying, oh, I don't have time, this is something I'd like to do, but they never really got around to it. I will say that a lot of the students really did like the philosophical alignments with open source. So this one in particular, who was a woman who also worked part-time while she was attending college. She said that she loved the ability to make things more accessible, especially to marginalized communities. And so while she wasn't contributing to open source, she saw this as something she'd like to do in the future. And hopefully she does. So yeah, I do want to come back to this challenge of how do we enhance open source communities to encourage sustained participation from younger and underrepresented contributors. If they just see it as a means to an end, I'm not really sure where we go from there. And so it's an open question that I will be figuring out in my dissertation. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks, everybody. Oh, now that's large text. But yeah, I'm on the job market. Please pray for me. And yeah, happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Hana. We'll fix our font sizes next year. Any questions? Yes.